World Solution Writing Process Podcast, Episode 4, Parallel Government Part 4. Hopefully there will only be 5. Hopefully I will knock out about 10 pages per episode for the next 2 episodes, and then I can move on to some other topic. I know you're probably tired of hearing the words parallel government over and over. As obsessed with it as I am, even I am tired of hearing it. So we'll get to some other topic like strategy, flipping the pillars, how do you, hijack Gene Sharp, liberal, nonviolent, revolutionary strategy for the purpose of fighting capitalism, or maybe something else. Maybe I'll just roll a die to decide. Anyway, episode 4, quick recap. Purpose of this podcast is to save the world from the impending social collapse induced by climate change, because I don't think the capitalist system is going to overhaul the energy grid from fossil fuels to renewables, or really I should say non-carbon emitting in the next 5-6 years, which it would need to do. And, it's funny, I was talking to someone, I said, well, we're going to have to do that to keep the food supply from collapsing. And they said, oh yeah, but we'll just switch it out for artificial food. And I'm thinking, do you really want to live in Soylent Green? The reasons are more than just the climate collapse. The reasons are that as capitalism proceeds, the concentration of capital increases, inequality increases, it undergoes the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which the ruling class solves by imposing even more wealth inequality, even more impoverishment. So I guess it's possible that society could survive, but in a worse and worse form in which it's not even worth living. So I don't put up with people's complacency and acquiescence. I find it dystopian. And I could be doing anything but this. I could be taking Molly and going to a techno festival. That would be great, actually. I would rather do that. But every time I do things like that, the whole time I'm there, I just feel this crushing alienation that the world is going to hell and that I'm just partying while the world burns. I'd rather actually face it head on. So this is World Solution Writing Process Podcast. Diving into my notes where I'm writing a book, but the book is written in scrambled out of order stream of consciousness form, trying to get it into sequence, helping myself mentally process, allowing others to listen in directly to my writing process by hearing me read my notes to myself. Let's dive into those notes on parallel government. In the Western situation, redistribution and economic transformation are the only and ultimate legitimacy. If all our governments are technically elected, but continue to torture the people under a regime of artificial scarcity, then something is wrong with our whole election system. A parallel government which doesn't attempt to install itself into power, but instead acts solely as a protest, such as Extinction Rebellion's People's Assemblies, can create some pressure for reforms, but can also spread confusion and demoralization about the necessary tasks. It is impossible to change the world without taking power after all. Of course, every parallel government is an ongoing protest intrinsically, but the question is, are you really trying to take power or not? Parallel government is political engineering, statecraft in its purest. Any group or individual can become a parallel government by the simple act of beginning to consider themselves one, though it would be best to formalize it with a vote or resolution. At that point, you should proclaim your existence to the public if that is safe to do in your country. Maybe you have to proliferate word of your existence underground if it's not safe to do in your country. And in many cases, individual communication is more advantageous than big blasts anyway. This may take the form of a public event, or if you are running an underground parallel government, it may be some anonymous, untraceable declaration or manifesto somewhere on the internet posted through anonymous accounts and, VPNs, or a one-on-one promotion campaign communicated to individuals. Parallel government is the answer to the question, how do you start a political rupture against the existing state order? It's not the answer anarchists want, but the world can't always revolve around their expectations, and hopefully they'll be happy with most of the changes we'll make anyway. This is sort of the answer to the great challenge posed by Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who said, I would sell my mother, his words, to get a movie called V for Vendetta Part 2 and see what happened after. This is kind of the answer to that. This whole book, in a certain sense, is the answer to that. Anyway, in a certain sense, every movement is faced with the question of how to reach critical mass, how to, quote, go viral, and parallel government is the missing key. However, many movements have ballooned into huge protests without bringing down governments, or even winning many reforms. So it's also the missing piece to the question of how to help these ephemeral mass movements, which rise and disappear, achieve their hopes of systemic change instead of just fizzling out, which is what everything does when it lacks its next step. Parallel governments can be formed by members of the ruling class, ordinary people, or both. The difference between an open versus closed membership of a parallel government is the trade-off between participation versus stability. The art of revolution is the art of government itself, politics itself. Parallel government is not abstract, but the key to advancing the concrete struggle. Concrete struggle is the key to creating large shifts in mass consciousness on the basis of the base versus superstructure materialist approach to ideas and consciousness. Material struggles such as protests, civil disobedience, and labor strikes shift consciousness more than communication, but to upgrade the protest and labor movement to their next stage of size and revolutionary consciousness, we now need a revolutionary government. At this point, the true, quote, voluntarist, unsustainable action would be to continue doing anything at all without forming an opposition government to back it up. Without forming a revolutionary government, virtually all political activity is wasted energy on the basis of it being incapable of achieving its own goals. With a parallel government, all the same typical activity of the movement takes on the character of a nonviolent insurgency. Parallel government is the institution which can convert the de jure into the de facto, the ideal into the material. It belongs in the category of the ideal real and therefore has an air of surreality, magic, serendipitous coincidence, and synchronicity. The heart of parallel government is narrative warfare. A parallel government is real or fake depending on whether you understand or agree with it. The ruling capitalist government is legitimate or illegitimate depending on your point of view. The real question once a dual power situation emerges is, which government is the real one? Each government perceives itself as being the real one, with the other one being illegitimate, insurgent, usurper upstarts. We are also confronted with the question of which government should be the real one. This is the narrative warfare at the heart of all politics and organizing, and certainly at the heart of parallel government. Parallel governments are born in the decision to create one, whether in the group vote or in the mind of an individual spearheading organizer. In this sense, the demands we raise are not so much demands addressed toward the ruling government, but toward society, as platform and promise of the revolutionary government. Parallel government can be an act of redesignation. A group can decide to formalize a political struggle which was already forming, or an established group can repurpose itself into a parallel government. The purpose of parallel government is supposed to serve is not to have any mistaken beliefs that it actually has any command or control of government agencies in the beginning. A parallel government does not pretend to hold power, but forms itself as a protest opposition against the current government, demanding support from the general public, but also from security forces and government agencies. At a certain level, all politics is parallel government. The key is to make it explicit instead of implicit in order to push the situation to its decisive critical mass. This is good. So I'm recording this the night the Napoleon movie comes out. Here's a mention of Napoleon. It's not only Napoleon who proves that self-appointment is the heart of power, but also more democratic examples. The Third Estate appointed itself the National Assembly at the Tennis Court Oath. Who gave the Continental Congress a mandate to declare themselves a new government more than themselves? They had permission from colonial delegates, but who authorized the colonial delegates? Possibly the committees of correspondence, but who are they to just go ahead and support the formation of an opposition government? A bunch of upstarts. No one gave them permission, but they themselves. And so the Continental Congress voted on July 2nd, 1776 to declare independence, turning the Continental Congress from a protest meeting to an opposition government. It may be helpful to form both a revolutionary legislature and a provisional administration, executive branch. A government of amateurish ordinary people possessing zero governmental experience but strong redistributive politics is better than a capitalist government of professionals. In the national independence movement, the resistance organization itself often functioned implicitly as a parallel government, and forming a parallel government feels more normal and natural in national independence movements because it is more precedented than socialist parallel governments being formed at will, with socialists usually supporting workers' councils as a parallel government. For revolutions within nations, rather than one nation revolting against another, we have to look back to the Enlightenment democracy revolutions, which included such parallel governments as the English Parliament gone renegade against the king, the American Continental Congress, which was formed partly from renegade colonial authorities, partly from the activist committees of correspondence and the paramilitary Sons of Liberty militias. Also included is the French National Assembly, which began as the Third Estate under the aristocratic regime, but reconvened in a tennis court as an independent people's government. Any capitalist revolutionary governments, on the other hand, tend not to include breakaways from capitalist governments, instead being formed independently and consisting entirely of ordinary people with little or no past in the capitalist government. It makes sense to literally form an opposition government out of a small committee, the same way that a terrorist group would, except then instead of fighting for the parallel government with violence, you fight for it with protest, civil disobedience, persuasion, and organizing. During the ridiculous House of Representatives Speaker election of 2023, the not yet sworn-in, quote, representatives-elect, which was their title at the time, effectively functioned as a provisional government. They did not hold governmental power. They were a temporary transitional government for the purpose of constituting a government, because the House of Representatives does not really count as being the House of Representatives until the Speaker is elected, and then the normal rules can proceed. It was really fun to watch the person with the gavel having to constantly have the House parliamentarian whispering in their ear during that very strange time in early 2023. Apparently there was a parallel government in the Dutch Revolution, which was an early iteration of the Reformation. We know we hold no actual power, but we continued to contend we ought to. This is the essence of dual power. There's no reason you can't start and run an opposition government over Zoom meetings. Parallel government can seem both genius and foolish. So obscure as to be ridiculous, but so commonplace as to seem obvious in retrospect. If at any point this makes you feel ridiculous, remember you're doing it for the people. A little indignity can be endured for the people. To be clear, advocating a parallel government as opposed to workers' councils places us more in the strategy traditional to national liberation movements and bourgeois revolutions than strict Leninism. While Lenin did advocate for a democratic capitalist provisional revolutionary government for Russia back in 1905 in his pamphlet/book, Two Tactics of Social Democracy, Leninism tends to advocate the formation of revolutionary governments as a concrete step once the people are already in a state of mass protest or struggle. Countries like South Africa, Palestine, and the early USA formed revolutionary governments either in the beginning or middle of their national struggles. So the Norwegian king formed a government in exile against the Nazis from 1940 to 1945. Long live the world-shaking power of our arbitrary declarations. Asymmetric narrative warfare is where you claim to be the legitimate government despite having less popular support and fewer media resources than the ruling government. Just as guerrilla warfare can imbalance a larger foe, so does narrative guerrilla warfare allow small forces to punch above their weight on the basis that their narrative is more true or their cause is more just. There were reasonable fears of another January 6 during the interregnum of the speaker election. Notably, they continued their disruption throughout the day January 6, 2023, the 2-year anniversary of the January 6 coup attempt. Parallel government always causes a bit of confusion. It would seem like a bunch of people just role-playing at first because many people would assume that a government is only a real government once it is in charge. However, the main disproof of this is a government in exile, as well as the various revolutionary governments in history which existed simultaneously with ruling governments and contended for power. A parallel government may not hold power immediately, but can still organize to grow its support until it manages to install itself into power. A provisional government or revolutionary government can therefore be thought of as the domestic version of a government in exile. A little bit repetitive, kind of worth repeating. To review the history of parallel governments would be to review the history of many of the revolutionary governments which emerged throughout history. Even if a parallel government isn't built out of workers' councils, its main support base will still be the common people. While union-paid staff would typically want nothing to do with a revolutionary government, some labor activists might, and some rank-and-file workers too. The key is to build these relationships between the revolutionary government and such labor forces without having any illusions that official union locals as a whole will ever endorse a revolutionary government in the current conditions. They might do such a thing during waves of mass protest or once a revolutionary government already has mass support. For example, labor unions got on board with Occupy Wall Street, not so much in the building phase, but once the demonstrations had begun. I think that's true. I don't remember there being, I don't know, there's this meeting that prepared Occupy Wall Street, which is like kind of mythic. I wasn't there. Apparently some people were. But there was a pre-meeting attended by people who were part of the European anti-austerity movement in the summer of 2011, before Occupy in the fall of 2011. So there was this kind of like international, Occupy Wall Street was really started by Adbusters, a magazine based in Canada. So it's true that you can't always just will things into existence. Rosa Luxemburg noted that, for example, you can't declare a mass strike by force of will, but they simply occur. Quote, to fix beforehand the cause and the moment from and in which the mass strikes in Germany will break out is not in the power of social democracy, because it is not in its power to bring about historical situations by resolutions at party congresses. Conversely, the Continental Congress did very much bring about a historical situation by passing a resolution for American independence. A Lenin quote? Okay, it's an article called Our Tasks and the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, written in 1905 during the 1905 revolution, during which workers took over their workplaces and formed a central body of delegates from each of these workplaces in mutiny, known as Soviets. What did Lenin say? He said, I believe that politically the Soviet of Workers' Deputies should be regarded as the embryo of a provisional revolutionary government. I think the Soviet should proclaim itself the provisional revolutionary government of the whole of Russia as early as possible, or should set up a provisional revolutionary government, which would amount to the same thing, only in another form, end quote. There's a website called Unicorn Riot, and it has a series called Revolution in Every Country, and they talk about Sudan. In Sudan, local resistance committees have federated into a transitional legislative council, in a certain way mirroring the federated structure of the Russian workers' councils, except federated from local community resistance committees rather than workplaces, established by the Revolutionary Charter for the Establishment of People's Power, which is a resistance organization. For as little media attention as the Sudanese revolution gets, they have created a framework of parallel government that can be used in both democracy revolutions and also in socialist revolutions with some modification, specifically the exclusion of pro-capitalism parties and forces. Most importantly, it is an example which is ongoing currently, or at least very recently. For example, in the United States, this is my notes, it would make sense to allow Democratic Party voters in the parallel government, but only allow Democratic Party elected officials if they conform to a strict policy of revolutionary opposition to capitalism and its government, at least when they're organizing and appearing at events of the parallel government. Big names should be avoided because they would end up pulling the parallel government toward reformism and compromise. Only local candidates and officials who are willing to literally take orders from the parallel government would be appropriate. Ultimately, that entanglement may simply be too complex, since we don't really need them anyway. This kind of gets into the DSA question of what's the relationship between DSA and the elected officials it endorses, and how much control does it have over them, and how much control should it have over them. Obviously, I'm in that sort of Bolshevik camp of you gotta have a tight leash on your electoral representatives. Notes. When many governments and parallel governments compete, as in various revolutions and civil wars, dual power can slide into triple, quadruple, or quintuple power. The Syrian civil war is the most recent example, and what an example it is. While there can be an initial resolution or declaration of a parallel government, in practice, the parallel government should hold ongoing repeated events declaring its existence over and over. Reaching the people requires repetition. Through parallel government, the parallel reality of imagination can become political material reality. There's a book called Carnival Revolution. It's kind of an edgy thing to use because it's about the 1989 movements against communism. But if we're people of resourcefulness, then it makes sense to take tactics that were used to fell communism in order to establish socialism. Use the tactics they used against us for ourselves. Then again, I mean, it's kind of complicated because at a certain level, it's hard not to identify with these revolutions against, this like Stalinist one-party authoritarian communism. At the same time, it seems like the Soviet collapse in practice was a setback materially for the people. That's getting into other topics. But in 1989, Czechoslovakian students formed a separate student government from the typical pro-regime student government, practicing dual power at the level of college. There may end up being as many parallel governments as there are revolutionary organizations, quite a swarm, and this would not be a setback but a significant improvement. Many revolutions and civil wars feature more than one. During the Russian Revolution, the provisional government and workers' councils were both parallel governments against the monarchy before they became parallel governments against each other. In his speech to the bare-bones parliament, Oliver Cromwell said, "You are as like the forming of God as ever people were. You are at the edge of promises and prophecies." Certainly anyone committed and advanced enough to form and serve as a member of a democratic socialist parallel government should be honored with a comparable high esteem. This was very good team building on Oliver Cromwell's part. In the American Revolution, the parallel government was the first Continental Congress formed in 1774 after the Boston Massacre of 1770, but before the outbreak of military conflict in the Battle of Lexington and Concord at first, as well as Bunker Hill in 1775, and the proper beginning of hostilities with the British invasion of New York in 1776. The formal Declaration of Independence was passed and promulgated at roughly the same time as a fleet of British ships arrived to occupy the harbor of New York. In the 1774 Suffolk Resolves, Boston colonists defied the revocation of their colonial charter by forming the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and beginning a boycott on British goods. The First Continental Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves as its first act upon meeting. From John Locke's Second Treatise on Government, written in 1689, nearly a century before the U.S. Declaration of Independence, which inspired Section 222 toward the end. Quote, "Whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any farther obedience, and are left to the common refuge which God hath provided for all men against force and violence. Whensoever, therefore, the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption, endeavor to grasp themselves, or put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by this breach of trust they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society." I feel like that should be immediately followed by Declaration of Independence, which uses very similar language to John Locke. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer when evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Yeah, I'm going to copy and paste that into my draft just so people can see that the Declaration of Independence almost directly lifted from John Locke's treatise on government. I feel like I'm in a time warp whenever I read aloud these John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. When I read aloud these old-timey language texts that somehow still feel so relevant to today. Because it's like, well, we certainly live under a government that is usurping our liberties and subjecting us to tyranny by, subjecting us to capitalism. So, that John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, the modern woke crowd would probably not be like very interested in these people. But is the modern woke crowd really the best judge of revolutionary strategy? They just seem like constant moralistic outrage and no attention to the engineering of how we will actually change society. So I look to these foundations with what I consider to be justified reasons, in that when you're someone who's seriously looking at revolution, it's a tradition. There's a revolutionary tradition. And you find yourself dealing with problems similar to those who came before you, and dealing with stresses and traumas similar to those who came before you. And it makes sense to go back and read about the lives of these people, what drove them to the point where they were willing to make these decisive breaks and ruptures. What traumas did they suffer? How did they deal with it? Some of them turned to religion. Some of them just turned to trying to forge some kind of deep personal strength. Some of them turned to engineering. because when humanity doesn't behave, sometimes you need some help from some machines to spank humanity back into behaving. Back to the notes. An example of nonviolent non-cooperation combined with parallel government is when, during the standoff at New York Harbor in 1776, George Washington repeatedly refused letters from British emissaries on the basis that these letters were addressed to Washington as a private citizen and not to Washington as a General Washington. This was a subtle way of the British refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the Continental Congress, which had given him his position as general. Washington was engaging in parallel government by insisting on being addressed by the governmental title given to him by an insurgent government, which the British didn't recognize. In this way, for the British to even communicate with Washington, they would be forced to implicitly acknowledge the legitimacy of the new government he served. So this would be like if we formed a parallel government and the United States government sent us a letter saying, like, cease and desist, this is, illegal activity. And I refused to open the letter or answer the communication on the basis of them addressing me just by my legal name instead of addressing me as parliamentarian Mr. Sir. That's basically what George Washington was doing. But it is an example of nonviolent non-cooperation combined with parallel government. The First Continental Congress was formed out of delegates from various committees of correspondence, essentially self-appointed activist committees, or sometimes extensions of the colonial legislatures. The Virginia House of Burgesses, initially a crown-loyal institution, also sent delegates to the First Continental Congress, though eventually the House of Burgesses was declared disbanded by its colonial governor, replaced then by the Virginia House of Delegates, an openly revolutionary legislature. Notes: rather than be bogged down in the bureaucratic rigmarole of seeking geographic representation, a committee of people from anywhere in a country can act as self-appointed national representation on a provisional and revolutionary basis. There's a Haymarket Books Essential Rosa Luxemburg Reader, and on page 108, at least of the version I have, it quotes a book called Lenin and the Revolutionary Party by Paul LeBlanc. It says, the emergence of Soviets was treated with suspicion initially even by the Bolsheviks, who were to become their greatest advocates. Lenin, who recognized in them the embryo of a provisional revolutionary government, argued but was unable to win the Bolshevik organization as a whole to this outlook until after the defeat of the 1905 revolution. That says a lot to me, that Lenin really was often an isolated genius, even within his own party. And that's really tragic. But, that's why I'm comfortable just being like a weirdo on the internet, just spouting these ideas, even though I have no organization behind me. That this central insight of the Russian Revolution, there were a series of revolutions. There was the 1905 attempt. Then 1917, February, the monarchy fell. 1917, October, the socialist government installed itself. But the thing is that during that initial 1905 attempt, it seems like Lenin was the only one, even in the Bolsheviks, who understood that the Soviets were a revolutionary government. That's astounding to me. It's a key insight of the entire Russian Revolution. It was like the central insight which allowed the Bolsheviks to triumph in October 1917. And at the first attempt, the first rupture of 1905, even most of the Bolsheviks didn't get it. And it was just Lenin alone with this realization, which is why I'm kind of fine being alone with the realization of the centrality of parallel government. Even with a parallel government staring them in the face, even the most advanced revolutionary socialist faction in Russia could not identify it for what it was until it was too late, leaving Lenin isolated in his viewpoint. Parallel government is intrinsically comedic and laughtivist, while also serious, because it answers the question of, wait, you mean we can just declare ourselves a government? With the answer, well, yeah. It turns out this seeming absurdity is at the heart of virtually all historical revolutions, in keeping with the tragicomic farce that is most of human history. The heart of parallel government is a combination of self-designation and sustained insistence. Vote or decide to designate yourselves, and continue insisting that you are one, solely on the basis of self-designation, conveying to others that you don't have some erroneous belief that you already are in power, but that you exist as an ongoing institutional protest against the current ruling government, and are growing your support in preparation for the removal of the ruling government and the installation of yourself. You may ask, what does a parallel government actually do? And in a physical sense, not necessarily much, but politics is often more social than physical. Instead, a parallel government regularly convenes periodically as an ongoing institutional protest against the legitimacy of the ruling government, building its own support movement in the form of spreading awareness of its own existence, organizing rallies in support of itself, and eventually protests demanding the removal of the ruling government, as well as its installation of itself, as well as formulating policy, To succeed in installing itself, a parallel government must flip the pillars of state towards supporting the parallel government, which requires a mass protest or a mass movement of nationwide civil disruption. Whereas in the past, mass protest tends to fizzle out, parallel government gives such waves of protest something to anchor around and center on, creating the potential to lead to a change of government instead of disappointingly dissipating, as usual. Fortunately, the very key to achieving a mass movement of such a scale is parallel government itself, acting as a powerful catalyst, allowing small actions to escalate much more quickly to mass national disruption, with another powerful catalyst being street actions which demand change of government instead of only demanding reforms. There is a chicken and egg relationship between mass protest and parallel government, with the missing trinity being street actions demanding change of government rather than reform, like the Egyptian revolution slogan of "the people demand removal of the regime." It is true that many mass movements succeed only by street actions demanding a change of government, without a new government being formed until afterwards. But many revolutions also form the parallel government before the final victory. A prior parallel government gives a stronger anchoring and legitimacy to protests demanding a change of government than there's simply occurring without an alternative government already existing. Furthermore, a parallel government allows revolutionaries to specifically determine the politics of a revolution by enforcing a certain ideological orientation among the members of a parallel government as the founding purpose and basis of its existence. This will keep our potential democratic socialist revolution from being derailed and hijacked into just another wave of mass protest, demanding reforms within the existing framework and inevitably dissipating into demoralization. We could form a Third Continental Congress. Unfortunately, that name has already been taken by reactionaries who are trying to, quote, return America to, a conservative framework of low taxes and all this crap. The point is to allow and encourage worker self-management in the workplace without relying on it to be the basis of government, as in workers' councils. Yeah, in the section on socialist multipartyism or multi-party socialism, there's a book called Revolutionary Strategy by Mike McNair, where he argues that workers' councils are good and all, but they don't make a very strong or stable basis for a government, as the Bolsheviks themselves unfortunately discovered. So instead, he kind of advocates a party state, but says that there can and probably should be pluralism and democracy within the party state. This is a little different than what happened in Russia, and he acknowledges that as well. It seems that the Communist Party of Great Britain, which Mike McNair is affiliated with, had a past in third camp Trotskyism. So if you read the Revolutionary Strategy by Mike McNair, it really won't make much sense unless you realize that it's a text which deviates from but descends from Trotskyism. So there's a lot of terminology and references that you won't really get without a Trotskyist background, or at least a Marxist or Leninist background. Anyway, I just think people should read Mike McNair, Revolutionary Strategy, if they haven't yet. I do warn that I personally found it to be a very challenging read, but a very educational one. And I also warn that I don't agree with everything in it, but the central point of the form that a revolutionary government should take, that you can just have a sort of a parliamentary revolutionary government rather than it being based on workers' councils, I think is very important. And it's something that a lot of the modern Leninist movement is missing, because we're stuck on workers' councils. And it's not that they're bad, it's just that, if the world is ending and the workers' councils aren't emerging, we've got to do something. And it can't be this, cookie cutter formula. I mean, why can't we borrow from the Chinese Revolution and install the new government on the basis of a party, but just have it be a more democratic party than Maoism? That, I think, might actually have to be the way. So while the USA has no history of declaring new republics like France, it does have a history of forming an opposition government, as the very way the country started with the Continental Congress. I'm going to look up on the internet right now, which republic is France on? France is currently on its fifth republic. America has only ever had one continuous republic. It may be unavoidable to begin a parallel government as a miniature legislature organized over distance online, with only a handful of people, or could be organized locally in person. One locality or online collective can declare itself a provisional revolutionary government for a whole nation. You could even self-appoint to represent a whole planet. The United Nations seems complacent and could use some healthy competition. Yeah, I think that's my next endeavor in life, to declare myself the provisional world government, because honestly, the world just needs a push. History needs a push. Once formed, the legislature can gradually legislate which measures the parallel government will enact once installed into power as the new ruling government, and this body of legislation should essentially act as a list of promises, similar to a political candidate's platform or a Marxist group's, quote, program. It makes sense to delineate core promises used for public messaging from the entire body of legislation, though both should be implemented faithfully upon installation into power. This micropolitics may seem absurd, but the Bolshevik Party, which eventually took over Russia, started from a faction of only 23 delegates at the Second Party Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903. And if you don't have 23 people yet, you can work on getting 23 people, and that can be a goal. I'm pretty sure 23 is this central number in chaos magic because it's the moment in prime numbers where the prime numbers begin accelerating from having small intervals to having large intervals mathematically. But I'm not so much of a chaos person. I'm more of an order person, clearly, as a person studying creating revolutionary governments. The Russian provisional government arose from the Duma, and that has to be acknowledged. The Duma was the legislature under the monarchy of Russia. There's a huge difference between forming a parallel government and a parallel state. A parallel state attempts to take on state functions like welfare, a hopeless path in the extremely limited resources of revolutionary activists, which is why revolutionaries frequently transition from attempting to provide services towards specializing in revolution. A parallel government is more like the Second Continental Congress, contending for power not through services but politically. Revolutionary government formation process, the process of formation, that's just sort of a fragment. Sometimes I have like undeveloped fragments of words that I just kind of maybe might develop or put into the sequence of the draft wherever they fit. The Afghani Taliban is currently supporting a Taliban parallel government in Pakistan, which contends against the relatively more secular Pakistani government. Again, definitely don't support every parallel government you hear about. They're out there, and not all of them are good. I do not support the Pakistani parallel government as enthusiastically as I am interested in parallel government. Now, there might be some of the more moderate mainstream factions of Pakistan. They've had a lot of political instability lately, but I do not support the Taliban parallel government. You should not either. Parallel government begins as a theory, grows to a discussion group, proceeds to a small-scale protest institution, grows to a large assembly supported by street actions, and becomes a new ruling government. I should put in the middle, continues to organizing nationwide civil disruption, wins over the state security forces and agencies, and becomes a new ruling government. Just trying to really summarize the process of how this works. Because some people say they can't visualize it, like they don't really see how a parallel government would work. They think that like you have to be in power to declare yourself a government, and no, the point is you start out of power, but protesting that you should be in power and that the government in power is bad and needs to be opposed. What does it mean to be a revolutionary party, to form a socialist organization in the United States that claims, oh, we're against the American government, we're against U.S. Congress? But then what are you going to replace U.S. Congress with? And a lot of them would say workers' councils, but a lot of them don't really spell that out very well. Doesn't it kind of seem like most of the left hasn't really thought through the conclusions of their own premises? That's really how it seems to me. They just really have not thought it through. And I've accomplished my goal of burning through about 10 more pages. In fact, I've gone over. I got lost in the rush and enthusiasm of recording the sound of my own voice. How glorious. But I'm going to keep going until I hit the hour mark and then edit it down. That's what I did last time. And then maybe the last episode can be short on parallel government. Wouldn't that be nice? Local parallel governments can and must be formed on a regional and city basis as a method of agitating struggle to the point of a national change of government being possible. Examples include the Baden and Bohemian republics of the German revolutions, the Paris Commune, the regional Chinese Soviet Republic, oh, isn't that just a beautiful little cute little republic, and the Shanghai People's Commune, which was kind of like it seemed to be opposed to Mao, like a reiteration of Paris in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, against Stalinism, against the Stalinism of Mao's Communist Party. Revolutionaries can proclaim a new capital city of the nation, just as they can declare a new government. I know I kind of said some of this already, but Fidel Castro declared the capital to be where he himself happened to be on 2 occasions. The Russian movement may have to redeclare St. Petersburg the capital of Russia in order to take power, with a possible regional conflict between St. Petersburg and Moscow. For those who don't know, St. Petersburg used to be the capital of Russia and was only moved to Moscow. The same may have to happen in the United States with New York or Philadelphia or Boston standing in opposition to Washington, D.C. If Philly became a war zone, nothing of value would be lost, and finally the city could be rebuilt properly. Yeah, Philly could use some artillery warfare to just knock it down and build it back up on a basis of, like, new buildings. I once heard that someone say Philly could use, like, a Godzilla. I'm like, yeah, in real life, that's gonna be, like, artillery battles in the, like, coming Civil War or something. I don't know. It just feels like it's gonna happen. Like, Philly is a place where bad things happen. I know Donald Trump said that, and I'm not a fan of Trump. I feel like he was right about that. And sometimes bad things need to happen. So if there has to be an artillery battle in the Civil War between socialism and capitalism in the United States, just do it in Philly. It's waiting for an excuse to be rebuilt. That's a really dark comment on my part, I know, but it's how I feel. Alright, you might laugh that a parallel government is not a, quote, real government, but we might not laugh so much about a government in exile, many of which have been reinstated into power. The Second Continental Congress was a real government the moment it designated itself such by the Declaration of Independence, though the British did not regard it as real. In China, the Provisional Government of the Republic of China, formed in 1912, was formed not before but after a successful uprising against the monarchy. In Britain, France, and America's democracy revolutions, the renegade governments all began to form while the old powers still stood. In 1945, the Viet Minh occupied Hanoi and formed a provisional government. And see, that's interesting because it's a communist provisional government from day one. We could do something like that sort of halfway between America and Vietnam, except it be a democratic socialist provisional government, a multi-party socialist provisional government. In Congo, 1963, you had something like the Vietnamese example. You had an authoritarian socialist provisional government. Ethiopia, 1975, provisional government. 1939, Poland had a government in exile after being occupied by Germany. In 1945, there was a Soviet-backed provisional government of the Republic of Poland, which was socialist only. And in some ways, you could say that was a model for what I'm trying to do, but also it wasn't, because though it formally had multiple socialist parties, it was really like under the control of the Russian one-party state. That's okay. In 1947, in Ghana, there was the United Gold Coast Convention. All political parties are parties to government, not too different from noble houses of feudalism. Every party aspires to power, whether by elections or otherwise. Therefore, every political party is a parallel government, which is why, for example, in African decolonization, many parallel governments are indistinguishable from political parties, and often referred to as political parties, as well as sometimes acting as social protest movements or as a military resistance. Obviously, South Africa is an example, but there are many others. During its civil war, Libya had two rival governments, an arrangement which could burst back into existence at any time during the uneasy peace between them. And of course, there's geopolitics surrounding that standoff. No good. No good. Yeah, see, parallel governments, something to point out is parallel governments are used between superpowers for proxy warfare, and that's not what I'm advocating. Instead, we should use them for popular revolution generated domestically by the people of a nation. No. Not interested in the proxy warfare, parallel government stuff. Not at all. The central task of forming a parallel government is simply self-designation of a group as a parallel government, gathering and growing a group around forming and being a parallel government, and clarifying the theory and purpose of a parallel government to the participants, which is to clarify which policies it promises to the people by its internal process of deliberation and legislating by vote, and to spread awareness of its own existence as an institutional protest by organizing street actions or other public outreach. Does anyone really want to do street actions anymore? I'd really just literally rather have a show, like a parallel government benefit show, except like no money required. Maybe like pay the musicians or just pay no one. Have a free show to promote the parallel government. I don't want to do a street action. Street actions are so much drama. They attract people who are so like righteous and moralistic. I hate them. Like, artists are pretty bad. Artists are, like, notoriously narcissistic and just drama and infighting, but activists are worse. I might literally rather hang out with artists than activists. That's got to be pretty bad. Artists are pretty bad, but if activists are worse, that's saying something. Anyway, I mean, in practice, it's often the same people, so whatever. If you feel a bit baffled or overwhelmed by the concept of parallel government, it's not you. It's up there with the theory of permanent revolution in terms of being very high-minded, maximally advanced, a vastly complex theory. Yet it's often the most advanced theory, which is most central to practical success, so we can't opt out of it. Then I'm going to close with Marx and the Civil War in France. Describing the Paris Commune, he said it was essentially a working-class government. So I've only got 6 more pages of parallel government notes, which means I'm almost done this section in terms of reading it out loud for people, including myself, to hear it. And oh, thank God, because honestly, I'm getting sick of it. I want to talk about other things. I want to talk about multi-party socialism. I want to talk about the strategy of flipping the pillars. And let me give you a preview into some of the other topics. Some of the topics I get into are a little spicy, controversial. For example, in one section, I will take on the notoriously infuriating debate of class and identity. In another section, I will talk about the concept of a national refoundation of the United States. In yet another section, I will talk about revolutionary dictatorship. Ooh la la. Most controversially, in another section, I will discuss the role of the Western world in the global socialist revolution. And I return to the old Marxist position, the pre-Lenin position, that the global revolution in the next phase will originate in and be based in the Western world. But how do we navigate Western imperialism while we deal with that? A lot of spicy stuff. I'm looking through my folder of chapters. I have one section, some of these are just funny, called Capitalism is Bad. It's like a beginner section for the people who don't know that capitalism is bad yet. I cover the main veins of Marxism and go into the history of punk rock and how punk was Marxist before it was anarchist. Nanny noo-noo. I talk about the police and the role of the police in revolution and how it's going to be very complicated because there's very anti-police narratives in the United States and Western world at this point. And yet, successful revolutions often include verbal overtures to the police, to persuade the police to cease obstructing and to evacuate out of the way of the protesters. I have an introduction chapter called Time is Running Out, Accelerate Now, about how the world is kind of ending and how it's capitalism's fault and all the ways in which it is ending and how accelerationism can be destructive or you can have a positive version of it, which is about figuring out how to accelerate the revolutionary process rather than accelerate the collapse of society. I have a movie list, just movies which I think people should watch. You know, some of them are fiction, you know, Keanu Wachowski type stuff. Some of them are historical dramas like Cromwell and Napoleon and all that. Dorky dude stuff to an extent, but I don't know. I've got the Rosa Parks movie in there, you know. I've got, I believe the Harriet Tubman movie in there. Rosa Luxemburg, all that. I have a sample declaration of national refoundation, or national refounding, which would be the sort of declaration of independence sort of thing, which a potential parallel government could utilize or modify to its heart's delight. I have a section on coups d'etats and other forms of change of government. Should the change of government, according to pure Gene Sharpian persuasion, not succeed, how do you carry out a revolutionary coup using minimal or even zero violence? Oh, and I have something on codifying a new political tendency. Isn't that funny? Aren't we all? You know, we're all making stuff up. My tendency is based on parallel government and multi-party socialism. I'm a tendency of one for now. Hopefully I will grow. Hopefully the virus in my mind will spread to infect other brains. Well, that's what I'm going to call it. Oh yeah, of course I have a section on nonviolence and laftivism. It's just like, how do you build nonviolence? How do you do that? How do you build a mass movement on a basis of nonviolence? How do you organize events? Yeah, I have a section called How the Movement Grows Over Time to make things extra concrete and illustrated for people. Though that might be kind of covered already in the strategy section. This is an exploration for me as much as it is for everyone else. I have to explore my own notes. I definitely have enough to make a podcast. I have enough notes to just read for years. Read out loud to you or to myself or whoever listens. I have a section on how to arrest rulers. Ah, that's my favorite one. Managing the old regime is a section. It's about how, say you overthrow a government. The people in that government are unlikely to just roll over and allow themselves to be just disempowered. They're going to try to reinstate themselves. How do you manage them? How do you surveil them, contain them, repress them as necessary? How do you do that? That's fun. That's one of my favorite sections. You know you love Daddy's repressive energy. This is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 4, signing off.